Welcome to Talking Digital Academy, the audio format for the Digital Academy conference organized by the Digital History Department at Bielefeld University. The Digital Academy is an annual online workshop that explores a variety of topics from the field of digital humanities. This year's topic was language models in digital humanities research, and the Digital Academy was dedicated on exploring the use of such models in DH research, but also on their use and potential in general. We wanted to explore the potential that emerges with the usage of language models and at the same time discuss how to deal with challenges and critically assess how computational methods and interdisciplinary settings may affect traditional work processes in the humanities. For an even deeper dive into language models, we held a special expert panel on an open space day. This day's expert interviews form the basis for the 3 podcast episodes on this channel. Our host for this podcast is Silke Schwand, who is a professor of digital history at Bielefeld University. Her first guest at today's Open Space Day is Tobias Hodel from the University of Bern.
Welcome, Tobias. Tobias Hodel is Professor for Digital Humanities at the University of Bern, and to name only a few of his roles and areas of responsibility, and in order to show that digital humanities or digital history people are also part of the inner circles of the workings of historians. He's a board member of the Schweizerische Gesellschaft für Geschichte, a very traditional role, but digital history is becoming more and more part of that tradition as well. He's also one of the editors of the Digital Humanities Research Publishing Series with Bielefeld University Press, which I will use the opportunity to invite everybody to think about publishing with us. Anyway, Tobias's research interests lie in the theory of digital history as well as machine learning in the humanities, and also with critical algorithm studies. And we decided that we will kick off this interview situation with a few questions that we kind of prepared beforehand, and then we see how the conversation goes. So to kick off the interview, Tobias, how are you using language models? What are your use cases and which roles do they play in your research processes?
Yep. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. As I said, I'm a bit scared, so we'll see how the discussion is going. But coming back to the language model question, I cannot imagine doing research anymore without using a language model. That's the situation as of today. I started encountering very basic language models when I started dealing with handwritten text recognition. So basically how to recognize stuff that has been written 500 years or 5 years ago, and that has been handwritten and does not or cannot be recognized using OCR systems. Within this read/transcribus project, we discussed a lot what the role of language, and language now in a rather linguistic sense, is when we do text recognition. And from the side of the computational linguists, of course, but also from the side of historians and other humanities scholars, there was always this emphasis on if we know basically how people used to talk or how people are writing, and if we can take this information, we can improve the recognition models. The computational side, the computing science people were like from another direction because they wanted to have this pure pattern recognition approach in the sense of a visual sign that gets to be translated. This was one of the first, or this was actually the first encounter with language models for me, because at that time we figured out that it supports the recognition process when dealing with handwriting, but also it makes it more difficult, because what happens if you're using also very, very simple language models is that you have some sort of a normalization towards a normalized language. And this was a huge issue until 2018 or so, I would say, when these more recent models that are based on transformer architectures appeared. And this was basically the time when I started to deal with language models on an extremely frequent basis. This means since then, what we're trying to do in Bern, or what I'm trying to do with my own research agenda, is to do information extraction based on strings of characters, basically. And if you have this strings of characters, what you can do and what we are all aware of basically is we can start identifying something like this named entity. So strings that represent something like a person name or an organization name. And basically since then, what I'm trying to do is deal with irregular languages. So I'm a medievalist by training, which means I want to deal with this Middle High German or with early modern German text, and I want to extract as many information as automatically as possible, but still with a perspective on what we gain, what we lose if we use the technology. And of course, and you all are aware of that, in 2022, the whole field blew once more completely up. Although, I mean, it was not a revolution in that sense, it was more of an evolution because we had it coming in a sense that this transformer models already showed in what direction it's going. But with ChatGPT, basically the whole thing exploded because since then what we see is that if we have enough training data, we can do something like a representation of this text that then can be used not only for this tagging task that I have been mentioning for named entities, but we can use it to extract some information. And I mean some information also represented in a spoken language. Sorry, that's a misrepresentation. So basically in a natural language, and since then, what we try to do, of course, is to leverage this approach. So to see how can we train our own large language models, and to what benefit basically these large language models can be used for questions from history, but also from other humanities disciplines. And of course, you're also all aware of that. We're starting to deal with the problems that come with it. So how can we deal with this whole biases that we find in our data sets? That was it. That was something like a long answer to a very short question, but I think it shows a bit that from my point of view, the whole field of history, or at least working with historical text, is shifting quite a bit in this direction. And this will have fundamental epistemological consequences, because that means that we have to have digital texts, or at the strings that I mentioned at the beginning, in order to really deal with that. We can only deal with text that is digitally available. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much also for opening up so many new questions. I was going to follow up with the question, are there any new topics or research questions arising through language models? But after listening to your answer, I might just rephrase this the other way around, because you claimed, and I think this is a very strong claim, that there's not going to be any research without language models or without these kinds of methods in the future. So can you imagine any projects where it does not make sense to employ language models? So where's the...
Yeah.
Is it really true what you claimed?
Yeah.
That, they're going to be everywhere?
I mean, the problem of this ubiquitous, if it's everywhere, then we have this issue that we're basically always in this bias spirals. We have the issue that we're constantly interacting with a system that we do not understand until to the last detail, basically, because the great thing, but also the frightening thing about these language models is, I mean, they are nothing else than a bunch of texts vectorized, to put it a bit simplistic. But that means that we're also a bit always behind the curve, in the sense of we are always relying on stuff that has been written before for this sort of representation. This is also one of the reasons why we try to build our own large and smaller language models, because then we can control what corpus basically has been fed into this system. Of course, that's not possible if you want to do really like a foundational large language model, and that's also not the goal, because University of Bern would not have the infrastructure to do that. So we don't dare to dream in that direction. But of course, we can do that with smaller models where we control that. Thinking of things where you shouldn't use it is, from my point of view, everything that from an ethical point of view influences the lives of people heavily. for example, for decision making. But luckily there, and then I'm as a medievalist, usually what we do research on, of course, hopefully influences how people think about the world and about their surrounding, but it does not influence them in the sense of that they get granted, I don't know, their the loan that they need to buy in order to buy their home or something like that. So as soon as it's going in that direction, there I think language models don't have a say at all. Also, if it's in the legal domain, but luckily also this is not what I'm working on. With historical sciences, I think it gets problematic once we start basically only relying for text production on this language model approaches without even understanding what we're doing. I don't say that you cannot use it to do some proofreading to try to improve your structure, but at the end, there is always this human decision that needs to say, okay, this is the form of text that I want to that I want to produce in a sense. And the same goes for my corpus, my source material. I need to have a firm understanding of the corpus. I need to know what's in there. I mean, this is basically a bit the topic modeling effect that we had 10 years ago. You could do topic modeling on anything and everything. So it was also some sort of language model that you built. But in order to make something out of this, you would have to have a firm understanding of what's really in the corpus, because otherwise it's impossible to interpret something like the topic model output, I would argue. So I think the critical stance becomes much more important, and the cool effect or the side effect, which I think is very cool, we as humanities scholars are perfectly suited to deal with this critical stance, because I mean, we have been trained for years and centuries to think critical about the output that we're getting from a machine, but also from our sources. So basically, this layering, this distancing that we're doing, and that's completely different to the natural sciences, I would argue. This is already in our curricula. This is already how we teach basically our students and our graduates. So I think we are the ones to explain what happens if we're using LLMs, and we are the ones in that sense that also should use it possibly.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can all agree on that last point and maybe have a closer look at it as well. You just said that in general, people from the humanities are very well trained in being critical, taking a critical stance, also criticizing source material, for example. Do you see any specific competences that we need to now start teaching our students, for example, or also outside of university and academia, to deal with the specifics of the outputs of language models? Like, how do you read whatever you can see, and how do you make it part of an interpretation?
Yes, I do. Although, I mean, the short answer would be, in a sense, we have source criticism, and source criticism is basically what would be needed in the world at this today the most. And in a sense, it's interesting if we have these policy debates of, oh, now we have this artificial intelligence, what can we do? And I mean, the answer is really simple. It's source criticism. Then you understand a lot. But I think source criticism is already well embedded, so we don't need to teach that any further. But what we need to teach now, from my point of view, is a basic, or rather, if possible, an in-depth understanding of how to deal with the approaches, and also get people to have an understanding of how this large language models or also simpler language models come into being. I mean, this is why I think the digital in digital history will probably sooner or later vanish, or at least I hope so. Whereas I would like to make the argument that digital humanities will not vanish as a field. So, but within history, I think the digital approaches are so getting to be important that everything, in a sense, needs to be digital history in the future. I know this claim has been made before, but I'm happy to repeat it also in 2024. So yeah, a bit to come back to your question, I think what we need is this data literacy, algorithmic literacy, and then critical stances towards the two of them. So basically how we build our data corpus, how we build the data that we want to deal with, how we criticize that, what algorithms do we use, what do they really do, so what form of representations do they create, and how can we use that, and how can we criticize that. I think these are the two trajectories that are that are needed, and I think for all of the humanities scholars. I think since we will be dealing with this generative text production mills, so like we will be flooded with this text, so we need to basically teach people a basic understanding about that.
So you would argue that it has to be part of sort of the general curriculum in the humanities? Or
yes,
would
I
you
do.
say we need more specialized
I mean, we need
curriculum?
both. And I think we need both. But I mean, this basic understanding of this, the inner workings of these systems, this is basically like using a library. When Wikipedia was entering the stage in the early 2000s, I was a student at that time, but our fathers and mothers, they missed completely this approach. They just said, okay, this is not the way we do research, so let's neglect it. And I fear, or I hope that we don't make the same mistake again with this large and smaller, with this language model, or let's call it AI approaches. I mean, it's absolutely crucial that from a BA level that we start dealing with that. And I mean, it's really like source criticism that we need to do that. And I mean, you cannot live your life in Europe or most parts of the world without getting somewhat, you are constantly in contact with this technology. So you need an understanding to understand our society. For the specialization part, I think it's not necessary that every humanities scholars can train their own, I don't know, embeddings for a specific project. This is where I still feel and see the DH, the digital humanities, as basically the culmination point of where we will meet. So if you want to do your own language model, if you want to train that, understand that, criticize that, I think there is where DH is still extremely necessary. And there we will have special degrees, and so we're starting just to build our full DH program after only having a minor. So basically, this is why I'm still optimistic that I will do that until I will retire in some years.
Thanks. Maybe we can stay with the question of who is part of the digital humanities in general, and how sort of this community works, but focus more on interdisciplinarity. So one of the questions that always arises is, if you want to be a digital humanist, do you need to be a coder as well? Or how well do you need to be able to like do your own coding? So what is your take on interdisciplinarity? And also maybe what kinds of support and resources are still missing, or are still, what do we need in order to make this work even better, if it works at all?
Yeah, I see a lot. I mean, the coding, I start with the coding question because in a sense it's the easy one, because I answer it in Bern in the sense of that we make our people take a Python class, which they have to pass in order to get our degree, even on the minor level. But at the same time, this is for me more this is a question of algorithmic literacy that I mentioned, so that you know how an algorithm works in order to then manipulate it to a certain degree. I mean, I'm perfectly aware that most of the DH people will not become some developers at Google. And I think that's also a good thing that they don't become that. But so, and in that sense, we are already in the interdisciplinary fields because we have this input from computer science, which is also key, which should also be more historicized, I would argue, because I think computer scientists, they always forget where they're coming from and where a lot of the issues that they're having in the field is coming from. So I think this is something that is always needed from history. But at the same time, what I'm still lacking is this buy-in from the rest of the humanities. So what I'm still seeing is that we have this bunch of, let's call them cool DH guys, and they are the ones that get bombarded from their colleagues, what they should be doing, what would be this best solution. And in my perfect world, all of these humanities scholars don't become DH people, because I mean, the field is really great the way it is, but they get more of a sense of what is needed. So that they work basically on their own literacy. And I don't think this is the question of generations or of like the next generation will come with this thing anyways, because this is not what I'm seeing, but rather we see that people are getting trained in their fields and they become extremely skilled and elaborate people, but they always push this digital a bit away from themselves. And, so I think the biggest problem is the lack of an openness towards this digital methods, but also the whole questions of the consequences of this method. So in a sense, I think it's not the interdisciplinarity from the other fields. The other fields are quite interested, especially computer science, but also what I'm seeing in medicine or in other fields. So I see it sometimes as an issue of the humanities that they always, okay, now they have a DH professor, so they have outsourced the issue in a sense. And if we can get over that, I think that would be extremely cool. If not, then let's move on anyways. So I think, yeah, I don't intend to wait for the next 20 years until my colleagues finally agree that it would have been nice to start these discussions a bit earlier. But I mean, that's a bit black and white painted. Of course, there's a lot of gray in between and a lot of colleagues that are interested and that are engaged. So.
Okay, thank you. Because we've been talking about more like general things for the last couple of minutes, and like maybe also I forced you to take a political stance on stuff. Let's go back to language models in practice. So maybe you can, because in your first answer, you also painted quite a broad picture, but maybe you can give us an example of what you actually do and how this influences maybe also your findings that you then present to historians as colleagues and not only in the DH community. So where is the language model in what you do?
Yes. So one project where it's like the easiest palpable is a project that I'm doing with the University of Basel, where we have like 150,000 index cards about house it's basically a historical house records collection, and it has been produced around 1900. You only can do that in Switzerland. So they basically paid 40 people to go through all of the medieval and early modern documents and look for mentions of specific houses. And every time this house gets mentioned, you take like a note and then you collect that. And until 2 years ago, this collection was only available in like boxes where you had to know, okay, I live in this street, in this house, and now I can go to that specific index cards and see, okay, this is the person that owned it at that time, and then they sold it for that, and then they had some loan taken out, stuff like that. And with quite simple language models, I would say. So for those interested in the technology, we're using usually Flare NLP. That's an open source framework developed at HU Berlin. And with Flare NLP, what we can now do, that's the project of one of my PhDs, is basically not only identify the persons that are mentioned or the places, so not standard NER, but something that is more relational. So we can basically say this person deals with another person in a specific way. They are talking about a third, like this object, and this object has been valued with that. So what we see is something like a layering of informations coming from classical NER. This is what we proposed in the proposal in 20. And when did we start? Like 2020, we started the project. But then later on, basically with the start of the project, we realized that we can go much deeper. So what we're seeing is something like a structure of how this specific events have been combined. And the idea, of course, is that on the one hand, you can now map that on the city of Basel, and you can see how many butcher bought the house in 1650 for what price and where did they live, stuff like that. But also, and I think that's more the methodological approach that I would like to take for, and this is basically one of the outcomes I would like to suggest, is that we now can see a structuring basically. So how things are done, not only in these single cases like we have learned in microhistoria or microhistory, but rather we can do that on a scale. We can see basically how in Basel they dealt with each other. And I think this is a quite a shift. And of course, if you're thinking about microhistory, this is what they try to do all the time. Of course, they focused on the single example, and then they took 2 or 3 of them, described them in depth. And we can do a very similar thing, methodologically different, and you can then counter-read this or you can basically combine the 2 approaches. So I think here you can see this layered reading really in action. So that would be one of the approaches. Like, if I may take a completely different second approach that I'm currently working on, is
sure.
we are basically getting more and more access to huge or vast corpora. I mean, we have this whole Google Books corpus, which is of course difficult to access. So basically, you can only do it through to full text search. But we have more and more of this corpus, and the interesting approach now is how can we extract this content also in a textual way. And this is where retrieval augmented generation is extremely interesting, so that we basically can feed a whole corpus into a large language model. We create these embeddings. So we basically create a small graph database, and then we can start querying the graph database. So basically, a large language model accesses the graph database. It has a specific question it embeds this question, and then it compares it to all of these small chunks of text the system has access to. And based on this access, what you get back is not like a very generic answer that comes from this representation within the large language model, but rather what you get back is snippets of information that have linguistic or semantical proximity to what you ask as a question. So it's not like in ChatGPT, where you basically get back like an answer, but rather several answers based on source material. And I mean, source material now we can understand in the broadest sense. It could be an entire library. And I've seen that Andreas Wagner is here, so they provided us with hundred thousands of scans from their library from the 19th century. And this is the approach that we're currently taking there. So we basically feed the whole text into the LLM, create the database, and then we start querying it. And the results are quite astonishing, as it's like I mean, in a sense, it's a search engine, but I think it's more than a search engine, because we're not tied to semantically or to strings that have to be compared, but there is some semantic proximity. And of course, the question is, can we specialize that? So in the Max Planck Frankfurt case, the question is, can we do that for legal historical approaches? Because legal history has a very specific domain language, and this is one of the ongoing experiments that I myself, I'm really curious whether we can see an improvement or whether it's the same. I mean, ChatGPT creates always this blah blah output, so it sounds nice on first look. On second look, you always see a lot of not so correct parts. And the question is, can we specialize that we basically get rid of this so la la outputs? Sorry, that was not very scientific.
But would you say that with your last, so thank you again, with your last example, is that something where we could arrive at training our own research assistants? Like for a specific corpus, have like an interactive chatbot situation where you
I'm not
can.
so I'm not sure if the chatbot bot is really the ultimate goal, because I mean, it's always cool to interact with humans, but with humans you get surprised because they come up with stuff you never thought about, which has a lot to do the way they have been taught, the way their the cultural background and stuff. But this issue is usually not the case with these chatbots. Chatbots are these really streamlined things. So I know there has been this science paper where they claim that basically now research can be done independently by the bot because there are several of them and they interact with each other and they question each other, and then some like new research questions arise. I absolutely don't think that this is the case, because at the very back of this whole system is the representation of the large language model, and that's language that has been produced years or time ago. That's already there. So I don't see where basically the innovation there should be coming from. So this is why I'm quite skeptical about bots. But at the same time, I mean, the advantage of the bot is that it produces something that we can work with or that we're used to deal with, and that is text. So, so in a sense, it's a bot, but I think what I would imagine would be something more like, and that's maybe a bit old school, but maybe like a library catalog that is more advanced and specialized, and that is, of course, also more interactive, that it provides me with the snippets that I'm interested in. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I'm not sure if I can answer it cohesively.
But maybe this is just like one of the, I think like one of the challenges with the kinds of projects that you described, and also with using language models in our own research, is always to find the right place of application, right? So what is the role of the model? And if I use too many of these bots, and if I kind of humanize them too much, there was like a discussion that we also had, then it kind of feels like I can delegate tasks. And maybe that's not the right approach. So it's not only a technological question or like a methodological question, but I think it's also a question of how do I frame the role that I give to using these kinds of tools and algorithms.
Yeah, I mean the absurd example is what the Zoom CEO lately released, because he said in the future we will be able to send your own avatar to your Zoom meeting, and the avatar has been trained on your own large language model, so the system will know what you would have said because it has seen what you have said before. And I mean, this is basically a complete misunderstanding of why we do have meetings. I mean, of course, I could have produced a video of what you wanted to ask me, and then I could have sent like the video image to that. But this is not not why we do meetings like this, for example, or why we do have team meetings or stuff. There is so much more involved, and sometimes I'm a bit frightened by this complete misunderstanding of human nature of a lot of this tech. I don't know how to call them. Without getting derogatively. Yeah, so in a sense, I mean that the chatbot approach by ChatGPT or OpenAI rather, that was genius in a sense, because they demonstrated from one second to the other why large language models are needed. Because before it was like, okay, it can create spam, basically it can generate the text that you start, but why we should use that? It was this effect of, okay, this interaction, and maybe also this humanizing effect that pulled a lot of people in. But I think in the long run, I hope that we shift away from that. So if I may go back to the Frankfurt example, because this is also another research project we're doing with the didactics department, and basically the ones that try to train university teachers. And there we said, if we feed in all of so the literature, usually if you're a university teacher, you have to do your didactics courses, or you're supposed to do that. And most of the people do it, but it's not with a lot of enthusiasm. So nobody of those people would go and read the scientific literature. But at the same time, of course, they want to teach the way that is being taught at the moment based on the literature. So how can we bring those two together? And the idea there is basically to create something like a landscape of literature, so that on the one hand, you see, okay, this would be the field that you're currently interested in. So you want to do something about blended learning, for example. There you would have the literature about it, and then you basically you can visualize that, and then you can also narrow it down to a certain degree, that at the end you have some of the snippets that you might be interested in, and maybe still end up with a paper, because this is what the team told me there. So that in the best world, people of course would read from time to time one of those papers and think about their strategies, their approaches. But yeah, it's really hard what thing at what moment you're interested in. So maybe try to do it, like a combination of a visual with a textual approach. Maybe also a bit like you did in Bielefeld with your VR application. So like a slimmed down virtual reality where the information is at your fingertips.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe I want to go back to one point that you raised earlier, and then we can wrap up our one-on-one and maybe open the discussion to the rest of the group. You touched upon like ethical questions and talked a little bit about bias, but I know that like bias is one of the main challenges that you're also interested in and that you've also published about. So maybe you can give us also like another statement or insight into where you see the bias problem, because I think that, you know, for contemporary approaches or contemporary users of, for example, OpenAI's ChatGPT bots, we all have an understanding that that it might be problematic. But what about bias in regard to like historical questions or sources?
Yeah. So I'm quite proud that I went in this bias problem before it blew up so much. But it was only by chance, because I realized when I did topic modeling of this of a huge corpus of executive minutes. So by chance, I got to the archives and they said, yeah, we have this digitized executive minutes, 19th century, and nobody's working on it because it's a bit complicated. You need to know how the whole administration works. So what could we be doing? And my answer was, of course, yeah, you do, as always, you do topic modeling. And then when I looked at the results, it was like, okay, there was always the same thing in there. And it was always it was quite hard to figure out what this single terms really meant. So there was, for example, one topic where it was all about the widow, poor people, and then it was coupled with this whole finance thing. And at first you think, okay, these are two topics pushed together. They don't have too much to do with each other, until I realized that in the 19th century, of course, this whole construct of this public administration came up, and they became responsible, or not only in the 19th century, but of course also before, but they were responsible for all of the people, where the husband deceased and nobody took care of the family anymore. So basically this financial cluster and this poorness cluster, they were not just like, they were not falling apart if you would create more topics, which would be perfectly feasible in topic modeling, but they were basically so closely intertwined, which also made me realize this is only the view of this specific administration, because the administration has to spend the money, and we all know how administrations are. Best case, you don't spend any money. So this is together. So we see basically how this corpus influences the way the algorithm has to output that. And of course, that's an interesting research result, but it's also a bit of a problem. So how do we build a corpus? This is a question that you might address in linguistics, but usually they say, okay, we take what we have, so and then we do research on it. And I think in history, it's even more crucial to think about how do we build this model? The corpus. So how do we frame what we want to analyze? Because this corpus will heavily influence every output that we have. And the second example, that's also, that's me as a medievalist speaking, we always have, or we feel like we understand the medieval society, and we can say, okay, this is this person, and this person has something like an appellation, something like a name. But and then we tag, of course, this name, and then we do the named entity. So, easy peasy. But at the same time, with each of the decisions that we take, what really this name is, we basically harden the concept of appellation in Middle Ages. And this is a huge discussion that we had when we did the scholarly edition project on Königsfelden, because there, of course, we wanted to have all of the persons identified, and we wanted to tag them accordingly, because there is something like a person name tag in TEI. And then the discussions came up, okay, what is really this person name? So is it only like something that we would consider first and the second, or first last name pairing, or is it a lot more? And in the Königsfelden case, we said, okay, let's really embrace this approach and say everything that could be considered part of a name, so for example a job description, we will make part of this tag. This is, by the way, something that we're now reusing in a sense, but much more refined for the Basel project and for this Benash tagging system that Ismail Prada, my PhD, is a lot talking about these days. But with these tagging decisions and then the automatization process, what happens is basically you define what the name is. And I mean, the easiest example then is with text recognition. If you train a text recognition algorithm, whatever engine you're using, if you're starting from scratch, you are defining what characters did exist on this specific document. Because only if you transcribe it with this character, or even with the glyph, this is the way you basically frame, in a sense, the perspective of the algorithm for everything that is concerned text then for this algorithm. And I mean, it's a simple form of bias, you could argue, and I would agree with that. But at the same time, we build the epistemology in that sense of our own analysis. And that's also something that should not be taken lightly.
Great, thank you so much. There are still some topics that we haven't touched upon, although we kind of tried to solve some bigger issues this morning. Our time is unfortunately up already. So thank you so much, Tobias, for being here, for answering all those difficult questions, or at least give us your opinion on possible answers to these pressing topics.
Thanks so much
for the questions. Everyone.